So if you just give me a few minutes just to bring everyone in,
I just shut the door.
officially start. Inshallah. There we go in. Assalamu alaikum, folks. Welcome. Hope everyone is well. We're going to be starting very shortly and just allowing everyone in. Just want to make sure we have a full house. So just I can see Dr. Saeed, Professor Saeed from the US of A. Hope everything's good. Fantastic. Right, okay. We've still got a lot more people coming in, but I'll allow them in. So, right, okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to the Islamic Courses Zoom session titled Book Discussion, Essays on Secularism and Multiculturalism. And we're very honoured and privileged to have Professor Tariq Modood from the University of Bristol, and it's hosted by our very own Dr. Shamim Miah from the University of Huddersfield. Okay, so just a quick reminder, Dr. Shamim is going to introduce the subject and introduce the professor. A quick reminder to everyone, I know there are regulars here, those who are new. If you keep your phones or tablets or PCs, whatever you're doing, on mute, it is being recorded, so don't worry. We'll send you a copy, a link to the recording. It will be on YouTube very shortly. But if you haven't registered, if you're not on our mailing list, please leave your email address on the chat. And there is a Q&A session. So we will possibly go after over an hour, trying to keep within an hour, but we'll definitely go over an hour most likely, because it's the relevance of this issue in light of recent events, as you can see, is more than important. Okay, so without further ado, Dr. Shamim, Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Shamim, over to you.
Bismillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ashabihi wa man wala. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this session. I'm really excited to learn more from Professor Modood. So if I start off with a quick introduction, and then I'll just quickly highlight the format of today's session, and then we can get started. Okay, I think, well, most people here would be already familiar with the writings of Professor Modood. Professor Tariq Modood is a professor of sociology, politics and public policy at University of Bristol. He was the founding and the current director of the study of ethnicity and citizenship at University of Bristol. He received a MBE for the Services of Social Sciences. He has authored, co-authored, co-edited over 35 books and over 200 scholarly journals on a range of issues to do with multiculturalism, secularism, liberalism, question of Muslim identity, etc. I think it's fair to say there are very few intellectuals, academics out there that have thought long and hard about issues to do with the Muslim presence in the West in general, but Muslim presence in the UK in particular, than Professor Tariq Modood. I think for those people who don't know, I think when Professor Modood started writing out on the issue of Muslim identity, it wasn't a very fashionable thing to do. In fact, there's a lot of kind of, you have to go against the current of the scholarship on race, ethnicity and blackness, etc. So I think it's been really interesting to actually see how we, I mean, as young academics, so we're basically reaping some of the kind of the hard work that the likes of Tariq Modood actually kind of put in back in the mid, the late and the early 90s. So, I mean, that's a quick introduction. I know for a fact that I've not done full justice to that, but I'm sure if those people who are really interested in following up Professor Modood's career, you can actually go on the website of University of Bristol. Now, in terms of the format of today, we've asked Professor Modood to actually give a 10 to 15 minute synopsis and outline of his book. That will be followed by a quick question from myself and some observations that I have on his book, but also his ideas in relation to these kind of big questions about Muslims in the West. And then in about 30 minutes or 35, 40 minutes time, we will open it up for question and a discussion and answers, if that's okay. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Professor Modood. Mizanbai, I think, do you want to unmute Professor Modood? Because we can't hear him.
Great. So can you hear me now?
We can.
Yes.
I can, yeah.
So thank you, Shamim, and thank you for the Islamic Circles for having this event with me, and Assalamu alaikum, everybody. So I'd like to, as Shamim said, say something just in 10 minutes or so about a couple of the main themes of the book, and then we can take it conversationally from there. So like my work in general, the book starts with anti-racism and multiculturalism. And I would say that it has two important features of what I mean by multiculturalism here. Firstly, that the multiculturalism, which is very much drawn from the British experience, unlike some other countries, I think Canada, for instance, unlike Canada, it builds on anti-racism, but it goes beyond color racism. And so from the 1990s onwards, I talked about cultural racism, that, for instance, South Asians in Britain, British Asians have experienced, and then, of course, British Muslims. This is a racism where there isn't a specific determinative link to anything biological. Racism does pick on people's features, you know, like skin color and so on, but cultural racism builds on that to create negative stereotypes, certain forms of racialization of the group in relation to its cultural attributes or perceived cultural attributes and community structures. So when people say things like Muslims are misogynists and sexist, or they are fanaticals or prone to violence and so on, they're not saying that there's a Muslim gene and that's what's doing the work, but nevertheless, they are racializing Muslims. And so Islamophobia is a form of cultural racism. So that's one important aspect of what I mean by multiculturalism. But that is, if you like, a negative, because it's anti-something. It recognizes a problem, but then what is the positive? What is the solution that multiculturalism's got to offer? And here, the key concept for me, derived from Charles Taylor's work, is the recognition of identities which are meaningful to minorities who have been racialized or othered. And this is mainly done by extending the concept of citizenship, of equal citizenship, to a form of inclusion, inclusive citizenship. And this has two or maybe three aspects. One aspect is that we then recognize identities as positive identities, the positive identities that groups themselves have a understanding of and want to project and get respect for in the public space. And these identities, therefore, are not just privatized identities, and they're certainly not just individual identities. All the time I'll be talking about group identities only. I don't have anything to say about individual identities. Insisting that these minority identities, like Black or Asian or Muslim, have as much right to be in the public space as any other group identities belonging to citizens. And this public space, therefore, needs reforming or remaking in order to positively include what were previously marginalized or racialized negative identities. And that includes our understanding of our country, our nationality. So we remake our understanding of our country. We rethink what it is to be British. We retell the British story so that minorities are positively part of it and not excluded or only negatively remarked upon. The second aspect that follows from what I've been saying is that this recognition is not simply a discursive recognition. It's not just intellectual or symbolic. It includes institutional accommodation, accommodating the needs of minorities in the institutions across society, schools, hospital, workplaces, national broadcasting, you know, like the BBC or the media in general, and institutions actively ensuring inclusion and the removing of obstacles, which is the negative thing, the removing of obstacles, but positively meeting distinctive needs, the needs of minorities. So it's not just a form of anti-racism, because it goes beyond anti-racism to have positive recognition and the meeting of distinctive needs. So what if the multicultural group identities in question are religious? You know, if some of them are religious, of course, you know, like Muslim. We then seem to cut across the secularist idea that there is an important sense in which religious identity or religion is a private matter. And that's really how I got into the issues of secularism. That I came from anti-racism and multiculturalist recognition, but then was confronted by a secularism which said, yes, that's okay for ethnic groups, that's okay for race, and for that matter, gender and sexual identities, but not for religious identities, because we are secularists here and religion is a private matter. And so in this engagement, I've tried to bring multiculturalism and secularism together with what I call the multiculturalizing of secularism. That is to say, the positive recognition and institutional accommodation of religious minorities. So I'll briefly say a little bit now about political secularism, and then, you know, we can have something more conversational. So one thing to emphasize is that I am talking about political secularism. That is to say, secularism as a political idea, a political project, political arrangements. So it's nothing to do with atheism or anything like that. I know this is a bit misleading, because often when Muslims talk about secularism, this is particularly true, I think, in the Arabic language, for instance, secularism is often a synonym for atheism. But that's not what I mean, and that's got nothing to do with my work. And one of the things I do is I say, if we look at Western Europe, there are at least two different kinds of political secularism. There is the secularism found in France called laïcité, which tends towards a certain radical secularism, because the Republican philosophy, which is not always followed in practice, but the Republican philosophy is that the political space shouldn't be marked by religion. That is to say, religion shouldn't be in the public space. So recognition of religion is not only not theoretically possible within this philosophy, but actually public recognition of any minority identity isn't possible, and certainly not any minority religious identity, or including Islam. And the other secularism, which actually is the dominant secularism in Western Europe, because France is actually a little bit exceptional, though, you know, it influences other countries as well, but it's a bit exceptional. The other political secularism of Northwestern Europe, which more or less is found geographically stretched from, let's say, from England to Finland, if you think of that sweep of countries. And interestingly, they are the former Protestant or Protestant Catholic countries, countries where both Protestants and Catholics are in significant numbers, like Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, the Nordic countries, and so on. And the key idea that I have, that I use to characterize moderate secularism, is firstly that, like all secularisms, the understanding is that there are two modes of authority. There's political authority and there's religious authority. But the point that moderate secularism makes is that these two modes of authority are not totally separate. They may and do have institutional and fiscal as well as symbolic connections. The state may support as well as regulate religion. The key idea here is that religion is not just a private good or bad. I think we all recognize it can be a private good, but the key idea is that it's also a public good or a public bad, meaning, you know, the other side of the same thing. For example, it can be important in contributing to the educational system of a country, or it may be a tremendous source of moral leadership, philanthropy, volunteering, and social capital. Or it may be a strand in forming the national identity, as it has done historically across Europe, in fact, so many other parts of the world as well. So this moderate secularism's origins lie in the state recognition and privileging of one religion or one church. For example, the Lutheran Church, in some places, the Church of England, in this country, but it has historically gradually become more supportive of a plurality of churches and faiths. And so I argue that not only is it capable of being multiculturalized, that is to say, by extending the recognition of one Christian faith or all Christian faiths, extending that to all faiths in general, but it can actually be a vehicle for multiculturalism. And I think, for instance, that the Church of England has been playing this role to some extent. So that gives you, I think, the two key themes of the book: my understanding of multiculturalism and of Islamophobia as part of multiculturalism, and my understanding of political secularism and how it can and should be multiculturalized. So I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. That's been really, really helpful. Actually, you've obviously identified the key, the markers of the book. So, for example, you know, in the first chapter, you're talking about racialization, and then in the second chapter, the second part of the book, you move on to talk about secularism, liberalism, multiculturalism, etc. And I was just wondering if you could just offer some of your observation in relation to the way in which you feel that Muslims have been racialized over the years, and which agencies are in part responsible for that. Because one assumes that the likes of the EDL, etc., you know, are involved in the whole debate and discourse about racialization. Sexual grooming example is a classical example, etc. But I'm just wondering if you could offer some of your thoughts in relation to the way in which the state does it, because often the case, the state can also be responsible in racializing Muslims as well.
Yes, sure, Shamim. So, so just to restate briefly what I was saying about my understanding of racism. So racism is not about biology as determining behavior, which is, if you like, the classical idea of racism. So classical idea of racism is black people have genetic features which make them, for instance, less intelligent. Or Jewish people, you know, according to the Nazis, are an inferior race because of their genes. So that's not my understanding of contemporary racism. That kind of racism still does exist, not so much in Europe, it's much stronger in the United States. But the dominant racism in Western Europe is a racism which targets the cultural, including the religious characteristics of a group. So it does use physical appearance as the starting point, but I mean, it's got to do that, otherwise it wouldn't be racism, because otherwise what's the difference between race and class or gender or anything else? So yes, descent, or, you know, ancestors, and then the physical appearance following from that, then linked to stereotypes about that group. And in the case of Muslims, of course, some of these stereotypes are to do with Islam, some of them are to do with terrorism, some of them are to do with a general idea about backwardness and so on. So you ask me, what is the main agency creating this? Well, I think you mentioned the EDL. I think they're actually pretty insignificant. I mean, the extreme right has become more significant than when I started my work. I certainly will have to, you know, say that. But I think that the kind of Islamophobia that we have in Britain or most Western countries is actually much more widespread, much more pervasive than anything to do with the extreme right. These ideas are part of, you know, how the media talks about Muslims every day, every week, every time there's any kind of crisis. So I think that the biggest engine of Islamophobia is actually the media, including the social media. So that's to say, how Muslims are portrayed, how they're presented, talked about, and so on. Of course, from that follows discriminatory treatment, negative treatment, exclusion, of course. But initially what has to do the work are the ideas against Muslims, Islamophobia. So I think it's this ideational element that is the most important and central feature of Islamophobia. And it's partly, of course, it's to do with how people understand Islam, but only partly. A lot of Islamophobia has got nothing to do with an understanding of Islam. Someone can be anti-Muslim and know nothing about the Quran, for instance, just as someone can be anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, and not know anything about Judaism and so on. So my understanding of Islamophobia is not that it's all about Islam or that it's collapsible to some ideas about religious intolerance and so on. No, it's a racialization about a group of people and their behavior and a sense that they are a threat because they don't think like us, or there's too many of them, or they're dirty and smelly, or you know, they are a security risk and so on. The role of the state, well, of course, the role of the state has become increasingly more important. So especially since 9/11 and everything that's followed, you know, the so-called war on terror, the securitization of minority issues, especially to do with Muslims in Britain and just about every other Western country in this period of time, seeing Muslims as a security risk, as a fifth column, not as a resource to fight Islamicist terrorism, but as sympathizers of Islamicist terrorism and therefore not to be trusted. And then if the state treats Muslims as a group that can't be trusted, of course, Muslims will not trust the state either. So we have had this dynamic over now, you know, nearly 2 decades since 9/11. We've had this dynamic of mutual distrust. It's not absolute, obviously. There are degrees of trust and cooperation often much more evident in local areas, some local areas, including Bristol, for instance. But nevertheless, there is a very large-scale mutual distrust and suspicion. And the state has to play a big role in combating that. And I think the single biggest thing it can do in this regard is to realize that you can't defeat terrorism, you can't create secure, resilient societies by making enemies of certain communities, but rather of using those communities as part of your strategy, of isolating the risks, isolating the terrorists, and so on. I think people came to realize this, not straight away, it took a long time, came to realize this in Northern Ireland. They realized that the IRA terrorism couldn't be defeated without winning the confidence of the of the Catholic community in Northern Ireland. It took a long time, but in the end, that was absolutely necessary to defeat the IRA, that you have to win over the community rather than treat the community as if it was the problem.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Now, my next question is perhaps related to my the first question, because in this book and also in your previous books as well, you talk about this idea of Muslim claim making and how that should be looked at within the context of how the state has facilitated claim making in relation to previous equality groups as well, namely the Black communities, the question about gender, the question about LGBT, etc. And I'm just wondering that is Muslim claim making, is it much more difficult given the kind of social political climate and the context that they actually live in? I'm just looking at the Sunday Times paper and looking at some of the editorials in relation to the Black Lives Matter, say, for example. And also on Netflix, there are certain kind of Spike Lee's movies there as well, because everybody is trying to kind of to demonstrate their wokeness. And I'm just wondering if it was a different community, so for example, Muslim communities, and they were making certain claims, would it be much more difficult given the kind of the context of Islamophobia, anti-Muslim prejudice, etc., that you've obviously kind of highlighted as well?
Yeah. So just to start with where you started that question, Shamim, when you said I've written about Muslim claim making, not just in this book, for a period of time. So just to say, to the others so my argument has been that if we look at the kinds of claims that British Muslims have been making upon British society and the British state, to be full citizens, it actually is not particularly Muslim. It's just like any other minority or subordinated or racialized group making claims. So the example that I used was the Muslim Council of Britain, which obviously arose out of the Rushdie affair and then came to be in about 1998. And if you look at their first set of statements, they identified 4 goals. One was they wanted there to be a recognition of Muslim identity as a group in society that had distinctive needs and needed to be a political partner with the state and in civil society. And that's exactly the kind of claim that Black people had made, that feminists have made about women's movement and so on. So that's you can't say, oh well, this is something derived from Sharia. This is just derived from how we make minority claims in contemporary Britain or similar countries. Another claim, the second claim that they had, was about the disadvantaged, the severely disadvantaged position of Muslims in Britain. Now, at the time, we mainly had data, which I'd helped to collect, about Pakistanis and Bangladeshis. So that's what they focused on. And it was quite clear that Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, this is the 1990s, were much more severely disadvantaged by any of these measures to do with employment and education, access to service, participation in public affairs, and so on, than the average for ethnic minorities. I forget the third claim was about that Muslim schools should be funded on the same basis, using the same rules and regulations as Christian schools or Jewish schools. And the fourth one, I can't remember just now, maybe it was about legislation for incitement to religious hatred, which was, of course, a parallel claim to what we already had, which was incitement to racial hatred. So as you can see, so my argument was that this claims making follows a certain pattern, and it follows a certain pattern focused on Muslims as a distinct community, or if you like, a distinct political agent. Of course, that was before 9/11 and issues around what was happening in the world, you know, international terrorism, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and all the geopolitics that goes with that came up. And so that obviously creates a new set of claims that some other groups are not making, not having to make. But the question you were really getting at, I believe, is, are there problems today about Muslims making claims and having them accepted relative to other groups in society? Well, the answer is, of course, emphatically yes. I mean, look, for instance, at how much recognition has been given to anti-Semitism. You know, the whole row about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, the way that the government has imposed the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And this is true not just of this country, but it's true across Europe, across the European Union, compared to Islamophobia, which the government has dragged its feet on, doesn't really recognize as a distinctive problem, and tries to think of it in terms of just a hatred, not as a form of racialization and marginalization, but as it were, only in terms of the extreme cases of hatred. So no one says, oh, anti-racism is only about hatred of black people. We recognize that Bristol University can be discriminatory against black people in all kinds of ways. It doesn't have to amount to any kind of hatred. So similarly, anti-Semitism is not just about hatred. So why is it that Islamophobia is only about the very extreme manifestations rather than the whole range of cases which exclude and marginalize and give Muslims, you know, systematically putting all these things together, a second-class citizenship status? So of course it is the case that making the case for Muslims is much harder, and will probably remain so, you know, at least for some time. I mean, these things don't change overnight, though maybe something could happen. I mean, no one 2 or 3 weeks ago was expecting that this country and other countries would be so focused in talking about anti-black racism in the way that we suddenly are, you know, for reasons everybody knows. So it may be that some issue could arise that captures the imagination of British society, or, you know, French or German or American society, and which creates a very sympathetic view of Muslims. Because, of course, this is partly what the current anti-racism is bringing out. It's tapping into that people feel that the way that George Floyd was murdered, you know, more or less in cold blood by a police officer and on video and so on. And of course, that's only, you know, emblematic of so much else, that people feel, ah, yes, this group of people is being victimized, systematically and horrendously victimized, and has been done so for, an enormous period of time. So I think, I don't know what issue that might be, but I suppose we have to ask ourselves, is there an issue, or might there be an issue or issues where Muslims would be looked upon sympathetically and not as a kind of threat, but as people who need to be included in an egalitarian and compassionate way?
Excellent, thank you. Now, this will be the last question on the first segment of your book before hopefully ask one or two questions in relation to secularism, and then we can just open it up for questions. Now, I'm just intrigued to get your thoughts really on some of the kind of hot button issues of today, and I want to kind of locate that within the broader debate around Muslim claim making. Do you feel that Muslim claim making can lead to a crisis of secularism? I'm thinking about a Birmingham and the whole debate around sex and relationship education and the whole kind of a positionality in relation to the LGBT question there. I mean, is that a kind of an area of a conflict that you can kind of emerge?
Yeah, well, it certainly is an area of conflict, yes. I think that specifically the issue to do with the particular primary school program that initially Muslim parents in Birmingham and then elsewhere were complaining about. I mean, I think one could argue that is beginning issues around sexuality too early. The children are too young, and this is, of course, what many people have argued. But that's only a limited argument, because that's just about the timing. For some people, for some Muslim parents, including those protesting about this particular case, it's not just about timing. They say that schools shouldn't talk about sexuality at all, that this should be left to the home and to parents. Here they really are in a very small minority, Muslims. I mean, I think perhaps some people in every religious group will have that view, but they, on the whole, will be small minorities within those religious groups. And perhaps, I don't know, perhaps in Muslims the group is not a small minority. It perhaps, is more than 50%. What is interesting, it is related by age. So opinion polls show, I saw one a little while ago, that when British Muslims were asked about their views about homosexuality, about the legalization of homosexuality, the views of young Muslims was much more tolerant than the views of middle-aged or older Muslims. There was a kind of an age incline, negative incline. So it may well be that views amongst Muslims are changing and are converging on where most of society is. But I think that sexual education is going to be part of a school curriculum, if not primary school, certainly some point in the secondary school curriculum. And it should be. I mean, this is something for all kinds of reasons, not just about respect for other people's sexual choices and so on, but for instance, to do with sexual health and maturity. It has to be a school subject at some point or other. And I think at one point I put it like this, because I think this is what Muslims would have to think of. You remember me beginning my presentation this afternoon by saying the important concept going beyond anti-racism is recognition, positive recognition of positive identities. And I think this is exactly what British Muslims have been battling for, struggling for, just like all the other minority groups. And that means going beyond just toleration, because toleration, of course, is double-edged, because we only tolerate those things about which we disapprove. So the disapproval is negative, putting up with it is positive. I mean, it's more positive than trying to suppress what we disapprove of. So how I put it in one article some years ago is that sexual minorities, let's say gay and lesbian people, though it's a little bit more complicated than that, but just say, let's say gay people, they are inclined to want positive recognition for themselves, and they'll tolerate groups like conservative Muslims, i.e. they don't approve of them, but they'll put up with them. And I think conservative Muslims are the mirror image. They want recognition for themselves, so they want their distinctive needs met by the British state and by various civil society institutions, you know, like schools and hospitals and so on. But they only want toleration for gay people. They don't want recognition for gay people. Recognition meaning, oh, this is a positive identity that belongs to our society, as opposed to, well, I tolerate this, but I don't really want to know anything about it. So I think this is the asymmetry, the mutual asymmetry that we have, that some groups want recognition for themselves, but toleration for others. And yeah, so we're not going to resolve this quickly, but that at least offers an analytical way of capturing what the problem is.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm just ask you a quick question on secularism, and that, I know there's a number of people are eager to ask questions. And this question is about, I mean, it's a position that I don't necessarily agree with, but the argument actually goes as follows, is that secular societies don't necessarily have a problem with Muslims. Their problem is targeted and aimed towards religion more generally. So if they're demonstrating some form of Islamophobia, that is actually couched within their criticism of religious communities in general, and not necessarily Muslims in particular. And then the argument actually goes and follows, because when Muslim playmaking started to happen back in the 80s and the 90s, that more or less coincided with the decline of religion within Britain and various other kind of Scandinavian countries that you've kind of highlighted. I'm just wondering what's your kind of thoughts and reflections on that. And sorry, and tying in with that, and this is perhaps another question that connects, is there's this notion that that secularism is neutral. You know, this is kind of the claim of the French and the laïcité kind of argument. Can secularism ever be neutral?
Yeah. So let's begin with the second one first. So I don't think it is possible for a state or a political culture to be neutral. It must reflect some values. It must reflect some kind of understanding of what is good for society. So I'm not, you know, it must draw on a body of ideas. I just can't see how we can have neutrality. We can't have neutrality in various cultural ways, so that in Britain, we teach English to a much greater extent than we teach any other language. We don't say we'll teach all languages equally because we're neutral about English versus any other language, and in France, French, in Germany, German, and so on. So, and all countries are formed by their history. So histories are different. So how can we be neutral? So I just don't accept the idea of neutrality as a realistic political philosophical idea. And if it was possible to be neutral, then we couldn't have multiculturalism, because multiculturalism is not neutral. Multiculturalism is about positive inclusion, recognition of identities, not the privatization of identities, but the recognition of public identities, connecting those public identities to our national citizenship, rethinking what it means to be British or German or Canadian or American. All these are positive, non-neutral things. So if someone said a state has to be neutral, my first response is, well, that's impossible. My second response is, I'd prefer multiculturalism to neutrality. And if neutrality was possible, it wouldn't allow multiculturalism. So for me, neutrality would be a problem. On your first question, yes, some people do say, well, we're not against Muslims, we're not against Islam, we're against all religions being too loud, too vociferous, too much in the public space, making demands on the public purse, like, for instance, funding of schools and so on. And they try to be consistent across how they treat all religions. I think there is an element of truth in that, but only an element. It by no means explains all the Islamophobia in society, by no means. I think, firstly, when you already have some groups that have religious recognition in the way that obviously Christians do in the countries that we're talking about, then if you want a kind of equality between all religions, there are two things you can do. One of two things you can do. You can say, we will remove any privileges that Christians have. And if you like, this is the attempt to be neutral. We'll just remove all those privileges. And then Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs, Jews, you can't complain, because Christians will be on the same low level as you. But no minority ever asks for that kind of treatment. When women complain about men being paid more for doing the same job, if the employer said, okay, from tomorrow, men will be paid 10% less, women don't say, hey, that is a blow for feminism. We've struck victory. Yeah. So no minority is interested in what I call downward equality. We want upward equality. And nor do we want to dispossess anybody else. I don't know any Muslims that want to dispossess Christians of the status and the institutional supports and linkages that they have in this country or in other, Western European countries. So I think that there are some people who are, as it were, consistently against all religions or all religions in the public space, but I'm opposed to those views, and I don't think they deliver equality, and I don't think they're multiculturalist. But in any case, I think that initially, going back to the 1990s, when I first entered this kind of field, and there was some popular support, public opinion support for the recognition that religion is a public good and it deserves some place or other in British public life. Not too much, but not too little, i.e. certainly not zero. And for instance, there was support for state funding of Christian schools and Jewish schools and so on. And Muslims could therefore tap into that to say, well, we're only asking for the same thing that others already have. But actually, the various things that have happened, of which obviously the whole 9/11 and its aftermath narrative being very, very central, but not just that, but being very central. Public opinion now in Britain is less receptive to religion and public support for religion or public space. for religion. So now when questions are asked in opinion polls, do you think religion is a force for good in society? Fewer people, now I think less than 50%, answer that question yes. So that's a question without any reference to Islam. Whereas I think 25 years ago, maybe 60 or 70%, say 65%, that kind of figure would have said yes, and we're now going towards 45, 40%. So there clearly has been a loss. And I think it is related to the fact that a lot of people thought religion was going to be non-problematically a feature of the public space. It wasn't conflict generating in the way that, of course, it has been in the past. As we all know about Europe's history, religion has been a very conflict generating feature of European societies. And people thought, oh, we've put that behind us. So now, yes, some religion is a good thing for good of society, even if I'm not religious myself. A lot of people have this view. Even if I'm not religious myself, I think it's good that there should be some religion in society rather than none. Whereas now, partly, I think, because of the centrality of Muslims in all public discourses in Western Europe about religious minorities and multiculturalism, and therefore about religion more generally, certainly public religion more generally, people are not so sure whether religion is a positive force for good in society, and they now begin to think, well, religion seems to be generating a lot of conflict. Maybe the other kind of secularism, the radical secularism, which says, get all these people out of the public space, control them by excluding them, maybe that is a viable proposition. I hope that we're not going in that direction. I very much hope we're not going in that direction. That would be bad news for Muslims. It would be bad news for multiculturalism. I think it would be bad news for British society. But you can see that that effect has taken place. And so I think one of the things that Muslims have to have at the forefront of their minds, and I think a lot of Muslims have done, especially over, I'd say, the last 10 years or so, is how to show the positive benefits of religion in the public space rather than its potential for conflict.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That's a very a poignant note to actually end. What I'd like to do now is open the floor for questions. I did have 2 more questions about multiculturalism, but if I've got some time, I can ask them at the end. I think the first question is from Professor Saeed, and his question is in relation to the influence of John Rawls and the philosophy of liberalism. If I can get Mizambai to unmute Professor Saeed so he can actually ask the question directly, if that's okay.
All right, I think, can you hear me? Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Modood. Thank you for your remarks. Thank you for the book and, of course, your body of work. Reading it, of course, you do mention John Rawls, and you mention his thought experiments about the veil of ignorance. And then you give a very nice critique about how the multicultural discourse is slightly outside the realm of political philosophy. But it seems as though there's a systemic problem with Rawls, notwithstanding his thought experiment about Kazakhstan, about the right kind of Muslims who can participate at all. But the idea that those who are the architects of that discursive space already have their thumb on the proverbial scale by presuming that it is at least a culturally Christian space. And so even if one is granted entry into the space, there is the requirement of recognition of that space being culturally Christian, what Nancy Fraser would call the bracketing of the inequalities. So I suppose my question is that, is the system fundamentally flawed to then allow for a true sense of liberalism as defined by the West, and more importantly, how it would then affect discussions on multiculturalism if it's presumed that a dominant culture must exist from within. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Saeed. So in a way, this really relates to the question Shamim asked me about neutrality, because one of the things that John Rawls is promising, whether he's delivering is another matter, but is promising is a liberalism or a justice, theory of justice, that allows for neutrality between people's conceptions of the good, you know, their ultimate idea of what is good, whether that's a secular ideal like Marxism or a religious ideal. So you're asking me, isn't it the case that the spaces that we already inhabit and that Muslims are asking for some kind of equality within, aren't they already in some ways a Christian space? Well, yes. So, because you remember, I emphatically dismissed the idea of neutrality. So yes, they're already emphatically a Christian space, just as in some other countries, they are already an Islamic space, and in some other places, already a Buddhist space or an atheist space, and so on. So yes, we always begin somewhere that's already got a historical, cultural character, an ethical and religious character. We don't begin in vacuum, and we don't begin with neutrality. And my idea of multicultural equality isn't about trying to move to equality. Like, oh, well, we can't get there, but neutrality, yeah. We can't get there, but let's try and edge our way towards neutrality. No, I say the opposite. I say that instead of thinning the national culture by saying, well, there's too much Christianity, let's thin it down so that it's not offensive to Jews, Muslims, and others, we say, well, actually, we need to thicken the public space by allowing other identities, other ways of thinking and acting to also become part of our public space. Now, of course, there'll be a limit. It's not a matter of allowing anything and everybody, because that wouldn't be impossible anyway. But this is an opposite move to the kind of Rawlsian move. So I'm saying, yes, of course, we already have a society that has a Christian legacy, and this legacy is present in all kinds of ways, discursively and sometimes institutionally in this society. And so minorities are aware of that and have to negotiate that. And that's part of what it means to be in this society, what it means to be British, what it means to be American or Canadian or whatever. So making space for Muslims is not a matter of effacing our national society. It's a matter of extending, complexifying, and remaking our national identity so that Muslims can see that to be British includes being Muslim. And others, of course, can see that. Non-Muslims can see that Muslims are part of what it means to be British. So in that sense, I'm not so worried about the fact that there won't be a pure non-Christian, pure non-Islamic, pure non-Buddhist space. I think it's a matter of bringing these different traditions together in ways that can be seen to be a fulfillment of people's aspirations and egalitarian claims.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a second question from Muzaffar Kandilik from Turkey. And Muzaffar is actually one of my PhD students. He's doing some really interesting work on muscular liberalism, but I think his question is more related to Turkey itself. So if Mozambique, if you can unmute Muzaffar, that would be appreciated.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this informative presentation, Dr. Tariq Modood. My question is related to Turkey political position about secularism and religious community in Turkey. Especially in the last 20 years, it has appeared a more moderate understanding of secularism in Turkey, especially with the Erdogan governments. Turkish government has given religious community more roles and implements financial support for education and other social policy activity. To be honest, religious community, especially Fethullah Gülen organizations, given more power with this support. However, these communities began to use this support negatively for their own secret agenda. They use this power to restrict liberal values within the group, and they use the power. They use the law, they use the justice as a tool to increase their power in Turkey, unfortunately. And as you know, we faced failed coup attack in 2016. What approach does moderate secularism offer to overcome such crises? I know Turkish government has different purpose to give more role to religious communities. I know this. I don't know the political problem in Turkey, but I would like to focus on more religious community in Turkey, and also they don't have any racial character, but religious people in Turkey would like to live without any pressure from government. So my question again, what approach does moderate secularism offer to overcome such crisis? Thank you.
Can I just say that someone who's got their microphone on, I can hear lots of disturbance. So, good. Thank you. Yes, so I think there was a time when quite a lot of people, including myself, were optimistic about the direction Turkey seemed to be going in. Because obviously Turkey's had this very strong Republican and secularist kind of nationalism, state tradition, very borrowed in some ways, very much borrowed from French laïcité, about controlling religious groups, including the religious majority, Sunni Muslims. And we had bans on the wearing of headscarves in Turkish universities and so on before there were any such bans in Western Europe. And then we began to see, with the rise of the AKP and its predecessor parties, a new, more moderate interpretation of secularism, which was to allow religious people into the public space, to not insist that they be either privatized or very strongly channeled by the state into what they should be doing and what they should be thinking and so on. And that then began to approximate to my understanding of Western European moderate secularism. But unfortunately, all that seems to have gone very badly wrong. And we now have a position which doesn't seem much better than what existed before the AKP's first set of governments, the first 2 or 3 terms. So you say you're particularly concerned about how the communities, the religious communities, are using the opportunities made available to them. I'm afraid I don't know enough about that. What I do know is that the religious ministry, the Diyanat, plays a very big role in defining Islam for Turkish people. Obviously, the khutbah every week is written by the ministry and delivered by imams that are part of the personnel, the staff run by the ministry, and that this can extend beyond Turkey to Turkish communities in Western Europe. And I also, of course, know that the Turkish state has reacted in what I think is an appalling way in response to the coup attempt and the purges that have taken place, including of academics who had nothing to do with the coup whatsoever, sometimes have nothing whatsoever to do with the Gulen organizations, let alone anything to do with the coup or violence or conspiracy or anything like that. So in many ways, the response to the coup has very much breached the rule of law, freedom under law, the democratic process, and judges have been thrown out and other people have been appointed by the state, ultimately by Erdogan. So that's obviously very bad news for Turkey and for the religious communities as a whole. So I don't know about what particular things religious communities are doing, but obviously the Gulen movement has been persecuted very openly and systematically, and the Kurds, who are not necessarily anything to do with the Gulen movement, but they too have suffered much oppression and coercion, especially in Kurdish majority areas in southeast Turkey. So as for other groups like Christians and Jews, I don't know what things are like for them in Turkey, but I don't see where Turkey is now as in any way approximating to moderate secularism or even laicite. Really, it's a kind of strange mix of a kind of statism that we normally associate with those kind of atheistical secularist states like, you know, the former Soviet Union or the Republic, the People's Republic of China. But the difference is that the state itself is married to, is a vehicle for a particular religious group and religious interpretation in Islam. So it's unlike the Soviet Union and China in that respect, but it's using a kind of statism and a nationalism in ways that I think emulate the worst cases of secularism, and certainly ones that I'm pleased to say we don't have in Western Europe, though we have got some extreme movements, as we all know, right-wing anti-Muslim movements, right-wing movements that say that these are Christian countries and so on, but then they're not trying to seize the state in order to make everybody conform to a particular religion or a particular religious sect and so on. So I think Turkey at the moment is in a rather bad case of its own, and it'd be great if a way could be found for it to return to where it was in, say, the first decade of this century, because that really was, I think, a very promising pluralistic opening from the previous state secularism that Turkey has had for, you know, most of its history, most of, you know, the modern republic. Whereas now we seem to have something that is not like that at all.
Excellent. We have a question from Aisha Saeed. She's from Pakistan. The question is there any scope of reconciliation or compromise between secularism and religion? Can they both exist in a shared governing space? Do you consider secularism to be antithesis to religion? And if I can just, because I know you've already mentioned the point, but I think the point was more to do with secularism within the Western context. But I know that within, say, for example, some of the Muslim countries like Iraq and Pakistan, within the Ba'athist kind of context, there is a binary distinction that's actually made between secularism and religion. So if you could just give some of your thoughts on that.
Okay. So as you say, I've already said that I certainly don't see any opposition between secularism and organized religion. There can be opposition, of course, but there's no necessary opposition. And if we look at Western Europe over the last century or longer, I don't think we have much opposition. There was a time when the opposition was very deep. I mean, it led to wars and massacres and persecutions, but that's not the modern experience. But so Shamim says that you're probably asking me to think about other countries, probably Muslim majority countries like Pakistan, where my own family is from. Well, as we all know, Pakistan is a very interesting case of a country. In fact, it was the first country in the modern period to be founded on a religious identity. It was created, as we all know, as a homeland for Indian Muslims. And that was very much a identity movement, you know, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Quaid-e-Azam. And as soon as Pakistan was created, he said that he wanted a certain kind of liberal constitutionalism where your religion, your personal faith, should make no difference to your opportunities as a citizen in Pakistan. And to some extent, in the first years, maybe, you know, the first couple of decades, Pakistan did try and live up to that. Of course, quite a lot of minority Shia sects had people very well represented in very senior positions within the state and civil society and business in Pakistan. But other people then began to reinterpret the, as it were, the foundational act of creating Pakistan to say, Pakistan was created to be an Islamic state in some form or another, when of course it wasn't, but you know, they had an interpretation saying that this is really what the intention should have been, and let us now try and live up to that. And so that movement has of course grown. It's not a single united movement. Obviously there are different you know, divisions within that movement, but that movement has certainly grown, and Zia al-Haq gave it a particular state prominence with the positions that he gave to people, but also what the legislation that he passed himself. And so Pakistan now has this kind of very deep tension. A lot of the country looked to Quaid-e-Azam and his vision as Pakistan as a homeland for Indian Muslims, but a significant number of people think that Pakistan should be an Islamic state, though they don't agree with what that means. But usually some kind of Wahhabi or Salafist interpretation is common enough, and one which often doesn't recognize some Muslim minorities, especially Shia minorities, as properly Islamic and so on. So that makes it very difficult for Pakistan to operate as a state where all citizens are equal. And this is the position Pakistan's found itself for a long time. I mean, there should be a way out, in the sense that there's nothing in kind of logic or in theory stopping that happening. But it's a matter of recognizing that if Pakistan is to be a state for all its citizens, all religious people who are Pakistanis, then it can't be a state that is trying to live up to one particular interpretation of Islam, or trying to deliver Sharia in its extensive way. I mean, of course, some aspects of Sharia can be incorporated, are incorporated in various aspects of a modern welfare democratic state, you know, like accountability and honesty and integrity in public service, and compassion and meeting the needs of the poor and needy people, as in a social democracy, as in a welfare state. But there are other aspects of Sharia that a moderate secular state cannot embrace and cannot deliver if it means giving second-class citizenship to some of its citizens.
Thank you, Professor Modood. We have a question from Omar. This is more question, I think, touching upon some of the conversation that we were having just before we came online. This is about decolonizing the curriculum in specific reference to sociology in Bristol. I guess what your thoughts on that. You know, we can tie in the broader question about Black Lives Matter into this as well. That would be helpful.
Yeah, so I think, and I may have said this right at the start of this talk, but as Shamim said, we were talking about this earlier, so I can't remember whether I just said it to him or to everybody when the talk started. But this is obviously a very exciting and potentially very important moment for anti-racism, for anti-Black racism in Britain, United States, many places in the world. Very big demonstrations taking place in Paris, in Berlin, and in other places. So it's not just even in Anglophone countries. If you remember, when I was trying to give an account of multiculturalism, I said that multiculturalism went beyond anti-racism. So, because anti-racism is about preventing something, preventing discrimination or the belittling of people based on their color or descent. Above all, if we, based on their descent from African ancestors. But multiculturalism builds on that to say, well, okay, that's the negative. We want to stop the negative, sure. And there's no claim that we've achieved that, none whatsoever. But what is the positive that we are seeking or could be seeking? And so multiculturalism says the positive is allowing different identity groups to be part of the mainstream, not that they're separate, not that they're second class, but they can become part of the mainstream, which means that the mainstream must open itself to them, but we must also rethink what it is to be British or American, and so on. So that positive movement, I suppose, is what decolonialism or decolonizing society or decolonizing the curriculum is trying to do. It's trying to move beyond the negative, and for various reasons, multiculturalism has become you know, politically injured, politically marginalized, politically not regarded as relevant. And certainly the younger generation who are talking about decolonialism and so on often know nothing much about multiculturalism. So we had a seminar in Bristol in, I think it was last summer, and it was about decolonizing the curriculum. It was actually a day event, but the panel that I was on was, you know, I was asked to speak in a panel, and I said, well, you know, I don't know what the decolonialists are trying to achieve, which is other than multiculturalism. So one possibility is, well, they may say, well, we're not. We just need a new term, and this is what we've come up with. Well, okay, that's one position. And obviously, I'd be very sympathetic to that position, though I'd regret having to give it another label. But at least if, you know, we're converging together into something similar, that's very good. But it may be that they say, well, no, we mean something different. And so in this panel, I was trying to probe my co-panelists and the audience who gathered together to say they were decolonialists, that what might it be? What is there in decolonialism that goes beyond anti-racism, both anti-color racism and anti-cultural racism, which means including Islamophobia, and goes beyond positive multicultural recognition and inclusion? Is there something more? And when I did ask this, no one seemed to come up with something that I could recognize as more. When they said, oh, the university needs to review its teaching materials, it needs to have more ethnic minority academics, staff, and also students from certain minority groups and so on. I said, well, yeah, this is all what anti-racists and or multiculturalists have been arguing for in Britain for all of my lifetime. So you're not telling me about what's extra or new. So I guess I'm in a position at the moment that I don't know exactly what the claim to decolonize society or a university or a curriculum means, and whether it means something more than what I've been arguing for and writing about in my work.
Thank you. Okay, I think I've got a last minute, so if I can have the honor of asking my final question, and this was in relation to multiculturalism. I already know the answer, but I just thought I can broaden that out. I mean, there's been a critique of multiculturalism in the past 20 years or so from the right. I'm thinking of the likes of David Goodhart, David Cameron, even like Tony Blair and Blunkett and various other people like that, from the using kind of the ideas of the right as a way of deconstructing multiculturalism. Equally speaking, there's been a critique of multiculturalism from the left, and I'm thinking the likes of Sivanandan from the Institute of Race Relations, and also in the States, you've got David Theo Goldberg, etc. So I'm just wondering, how would you respond to the criticism of the left of multiculturalism?
Yeah, so, you know, Sivanandan is a very good example, I agree. So a lot of what Sivanandan argued, it seems to me, was a kind of anti-color racism. So, you know, he would say that if you're not white, you're black. It doesn't matter what you think you are. You know, we activists can tell you you're black because we've done an analysis of society and we've discovered that the racists say you're black and therefore you're black. So you can only have a single identity, and it's, you know, for political purposes, and that identity can't be chosen by you. It's being chosen, or it's being fixed upon you. So of course I totally oppose that, and I don't see that as being at all multiculturalist. And then he argued very strongly for some, you know, issues around class and class solidarities and so on. But often that's very divisive of the country as a whole, very confrontational and so on. So multiculturalism is about bringing people together. So those would be my two main problems with the kind of left critique as represented by someone like Sivanandam, that on the one hand, that it's trying to impose a certain kind of political identity and political orientation upon ethnic minority people and not allowing them to choose their own identity, including, of course, you know, Muslims. And though I got to say that in his later years, Sivanandam did change his mind and became very sympathetic to the struggle against Islamophobia. I have to say that because he did flip and change, but I'm talking about his core ideas as represented in his, you know, written, published stuff. And so I think that multiculturalism goes beyond that, but also multiculturalism is about forging new unities so that we can all be a society together, you know, a political society together, a body of citizens. And this is a national citizenship. So it's about how to be British together, which means rethinking, remaking our British identity and so on. And that's, you know, been the multiculturalist project, not dividing us up into classes and then pitting one class against another. Obviously, there are class issues. I'm not saying there aren't, but the class issues are only part of a larger politics. They mustn't take over and be the central politics, because that will just be a form of division and confrontation.
Thank you. I think that gives us, well, it's 5:30, so I know we said an hour, we've extended it by 30 minutes. I hope that's been okay. I've really learned a lot from your ideas and the exchanges. So once again, thank you very much for you know, giving your time on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. Ms. Mbaye, do you have any final thoughts, or if not?
No, thank you to the professor. Thank you to you as well. If you'd like to close up. Thank you so much, Professor. Would like to invite you back again.
Okay,
Inshallah. Session also, inshallah. And Dr. Shamim, would you like to close off? Okay.
Thank you very much. And that's it. Thank you. Is there a session tomorrow? Do you want to?
There's a session on Tuesday. Yeah, there's a session on Tuesday. If I could just remind the folks, we have future sessions. If you just go to the website, but the one on Tuesday is with Foundations on Ibn Taymiyyah's Religious Utilitarianism with John Hoover. And on Friday, we have Abdullah Quilliam and the Ottomans. That's with Yahya Burt and Dr. Mark Sharp. And then we have some future other sessions. But again, I'll send, if people are on the mailing list, they'll receive all the listings of the event. There's quite a few coming up.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Assalamu.
Thank you very much, folks. Thank you so much, and hope to see you everyone soon, inshallah. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.